Welcome back, everybody. Today I wanted to talk about the Milestone of Radiance alongside the Selector and who you should be looking out for from the Selector itself. Of course, the tier list itself is subjective and there are some considerations here, but I wanted to go over my thoughts on the accessible options that you have here with a quick disclaimer that, and thank you to a few people that have pointed out, Salome may be revealed in a couple of weeks from this point, and there is no urgent need to pull for or to make your choice right now for this. And since you have up to the successor Teu as your kind of guardrails for what you have access to, there are some considerations there as well. But I think the main thing here is that even with associating or with assessing all this at the time, it will definitely be kind of interesting to wait and see what Salome actually does, as we already know that she can copy literally any character in the game, though we don't know exactly to what extent things will work, including cooldowns, how interactions will work, and we'll have to wait and see for that. That said, I do obviously have a couple of tier lists here that can pretty much guide you alongside, or it can guide you in terms of what you'll be looking for. But without further ado, let's start with the S rank. The S ranks here are pretty obvious. These are all characters that either kind of fight or interact with the top tiers, or fight or interact with themselves. Briar Witch Iseria, of course, is really nice, not only to counter characters like Rule of Light, but is also nice, of course, for cleaving some of the tankier characters in the game alongside basically anything in the game, if you manage to be lucky enough to have that be the case. That said, some of the other characters that you're seeing here that are very powerful include Empyrean Ilanov, who can in some cases deal with the Briar Witch Iseria. It's a bit difficult to AoE with Briar, and unless if you stun or debuff or daze with a secondary partner to Briar Witch Iseria, the Empyrean Ilanov will be cleansing or preventing a lot of the effectiveness of her buffs. That said, it is also worth mentioning that Briar Witch Iseria, of course, is the more obvious and aggressive option to try and counter a character like Ruel of Light, though you do also have characters like New Moon Luna here, who are also kind of countered by Empyrean Ilanov, depending on whether or not you actually get to take the turn. So you have the top of the list here in the S tier, which are pretty much all the characters that are near first pickable or usable in the priority slots for something like RTA, or you will likely always end up using in things like PvP, Arena, your Guild War offenses to try and cleave or whittle away at whatever you're trying to fight. That's pretty much always going to be the case, and even if you look at some of the most popular arena teams, unless if it's a very specific cleave, you will see people trying to Briar Witch cleave, or they'll try to use New Moon Luna alongside someone like Frida. Some of these are more outdated, of course, and where you decide to use this will determine how strong they are. But just from a general point of view, I feel that these characters are incredibly powerful. And though New Moon Luna is maybe the most dated of the bunch here, I still think that for how incredible it is just to seal an enemy and kind of deal, as much damage or as much, or give as much utility as she can to the team through her book and being able to seal is still undoubtedly super powerful. She's still used in RTA. She's still used in Guild War and Arena. She's definitely one of the GOATs for this list, especially if you don't have them. On that note, we should move to the A ranks, because this is another list of characters that you'll probably end up seeing a lot more, especially after the introduction of Nodos. Now, what I mean by this first and foremost is that, well, a lot of players are still trying to ban or deal with Harsetti. It's just a known factor at this point that having a character like Harsetti is just a headache to deal with, both in terms of tuning for yourself and also to fight against. Yes, there are answers to her now, more obviously with the Aram and characters like the Senya. It's still not a very fun playstyle to play around, though, because things like the Senya or the Aram can get banned out, or you don't have perfect partners with them. That's primarily part of the reason why people don't like playing around or playing with Harsetti. She's, as a result, still incredibly powerful, and other characters on this list are also especially powerful. Some of these characters are definitely older, and characters like Zeo, Bellion are definitely some of the oldest ML5s that we have relative to the modern era of E7. But in terms of what we have access to, or I should say modern E7 while still being good, but for these characters, you've seen them, you know they're monsters, they're disgusting to deal with, especially if you're playing someone or trying to play quite fast. Someone like Zeo has the ability now to soul burn and synergizes perfectly with characters like Koli. You can also activate a character like Dien, who's not accessible, to be fair, from this, but you have so much accessibility and so much utility with a character like Zeo. You have so much debilitating or so much annoyance from having someone like Harsetti on the enemy team. With this, these are some of the strongest characters, and even though you may not even see them that often, unless if you're fighting against like a cleaver, or you may not need to use them unless you're fighting against a cleaver, the reality is that they are still quite powerful, and especially in content where you can force it, I especially think Zeo is still very strong with his Soulburn Ignore ER. Now, that said, there are the other characters in this list, and I think these are way stronger depending on what you are fighting against. Now, I think Maid Chloe especially is still very strong, especially with characters like Renax still remaining relevant and her being able to deal with some of the additional damage coverage. However, the reality is having a cleanser and a defense buff and a heal is just strong. There's kind of no getting around it, and kind of similar to how some people may use someone like Rule of Light to kind of stall or to go through Guild War offenses or arena offenses with a character or with a stall healer buffer like that. Maid Chloe is also similarly kind of strong, though I would definitely think that you're probably taking Maid Chloe if you don't want to deal with someone like Renac, which unfortunately is pretty much what you're going to see in like 95% of games, or in arena defenses, offenses, etc., or you'll encounter Renax in some way, shape, or form. Now, I do want to point out that characters like Bellion and Lone Crescent Bologna are also pretty nice, as recent characters or recent developments have shown up. Bologna is still really nice, as characters like Top Model Lulika or even the Shepherd of the Dark Dien are quite strong. Of course, Bellion also counters Frieren, who is still also showing up in this day and age, but the reality is that Bellion does suffer a bit if you don't have access to a pretty good set of gear for Bellion, or if you don't have things like 3F, as again, she does lack a bit of versatility at the moment, with there being so many AoE answers or characters that get pushed up if you do any sort of AoE. And so as a result, if you don't have either some way to injure, or if you don't have some sort of way to one-shot the thing that's, you know, AoEing or AoE mitigating, it doesn't feel like it's a very strong idea, or it's a very strong character that you'd want on your team at the moment. But I should actually talk about Lone Crescent Bologna, as you may be curious as to why this character is so high up. I actually think Lone Crescent Bologna is incredibly strong at the moment for a couple reasons. Number one, I'm a cleaver, and with cleaving, you know, a lot of players will resort to things like the Setsuka or the evasions, not just for Nodos, who I'll get to in a moment, but also because at the end of the day, sometimes you don't have access to anything better than just praying that you don't kill, and Lone Crescent Bologna does do a lot of damage, don't get me wrong. On that note, of course, Nodos is also really, really strong, and though he isn't access, or you can't get him from this Radiance of this Milestone of Radiance Selector, the reality is that Nodos is kind of OP if you haven't noticed, but one of the best ways to kind of deal with him is through evasion. I've seen a lot of people pick the Setsuka. I've seen a lot of Lone Crescent Bologna not only to evade, but also to kind of injure and chip away at him in order to deal with him. I think that's an okay idea at the moment, and honestly, Lone Crescent Bologna's S3 also does like a bajillion damage, especially if you invest into dealing damage with her. But the reality is that at the moment, she's just a fairly safe option. She, again, doesn't take too much damage with the evasion. She heals herself, as most of the time she's on something like Sigurd's Scythe. She has access to injury, which means that she's not only good against squishies or people that try to AoE her and can't hit her, but she's also injuring a ton. Now, would I necessarily use her in something like Guild War? Probably not. Mostly because, again, you can force certain teams into the Lone Crescent Bologna, and you can take someone like Xeno and it will be really annoying. But I do also want to point out that, again, the Lone Crescent Bologna is also a character who scales off of the number of teammates that you have on your team. And again, since in something like World Arena, in something like Guild War, you won't have access to as many teammates, this drops a bit of its effectiveness. Though, again, even in something like Arena or Arena or RTA, I still think she's probably one of the better picks, and I've seen her basically every single game, especially if you are trying to first pick someone like Nodos. And let's be honest, if Nodos is in the game, you probably want some sort of evasion to begin with. Now, as we move to the B tier, I won't go as in depth with some of these picks, as these are very niche or very specific to what you're trying to do. But the reality is that a lot of these are cleave options, or these are responses to some of the characters in A, though you will not always be able to pick it. What I mean by this is that you may in theory think that someone like Lionheart Sermia would be good into Bellion or into the Lone Crescent Bologna, but that's not always the case. There are certain situations where, again, you won't be able to get enough fighting spirit, or not fighting spirit, you won't be able to get off enough damage, or there'll be a character paired alongside something like the Bellion, like the Freerin, and it doesn't feel like you're necessarily doing anything to a target like that, or there may be other obstacles in your way, which is why it's not as easy or it's not as straightforward as just picking some of these characters in B to counter some of the A characters. Now, I do also want to point out that though I think top model Luluka is extremely powerful, and I was kind of like laughing my head off at how many games I could just pick top model Luluka and like cleave everything, the reality is that once people start investing, or they start countering you, or they start in early picking things like the Empyrean Ilinov in response to the top model Luluka, she feels definitely a bit weaker. I wouldn't say she's weak. I definitely think she's definitely in the B tier range. But if you are someone who's put in, your fastest gear, and then someone decides to immediately pick Empyrean Ilinov, they pick Renak, who's faster base speed, and you have all these different things like kind of against you or put up against you as top model Luluka, it doesn't feel like Empyrean Ilinov, or sorry, it doesn't feel like top model Luluka is incredibly powerful. I would argue, some of these cleave characters probably go up a tier, or are in their own tier if you are super, super fast. But the reality is, for the average player, I still think that you can make use of Luluka, even if you don't have the fastest gear in the entire world. I mean, she does do like 1 billion damage, by the way. But the reality is, or I should stop saying that, but truth is, you don't need the best gear to make top model Luluka work. You can have a decent showing for her even without it. Some of these other characters, though, do require a bit of gear gapping, or a bit of speed, or some specific strategy to make work. That includes definitely characters like Successor Teu, who is obviously pretty much tied to the hip to Zio, Commander Pavel with crit-based fast characters. Same thing with even Spirit Eye Celine, though I would argue Spirit Eye Celine it's a very 50-50 kind of change her build depending on what your playstyle is character. Though I would also argue that characters like Bystander Huayang and Lone Wolf Para are also nice, especially against characters like Nodos, who are incredibly powerful. But again, Nodos, or I should say Lone Wolf Para for Nodos, but Bystander Hua I think is nice always as a kind of baseline, that if someone is playing too many debuffs or is taking too many debuffs, she often comes out as a force ban, or you could pick her a bit early if people are just committing too hard to it. Though this is not a perfect solution, as unfortunately Bystander Huayang does kind of just get one shot by top model Luluka, and can also get screwed over by characters like Spirit Eye Celine, or some of these other protective characters on the list. On that note, for the C tier, I definitely can't go through all these characters, but these are all, again, even more niche options or answers to some of the most popular characters in the game. I'm not going to sit here and say that, you can't win with a character like Requiem Ruana, or that Twisted Idol and Kayron needs another buff, even though it kind of low-key feels like he needs a little more love. The reality, though, is that a lot of these characters are nice. Oh, I said it again, sorry. These characters are all nice, and if you want to play these characters in some sort of setup, that's fine. And I've definitely had my share of wins with characters like Silverblade Araminta. I've still won with Conqueror Lilius. Fallen Cecilia is still an answer to Renak, believe it or not. But unfortunately, a lot of the characters here just kind of drop the ball a little bit. I do think Architect Leica's buff is interesting. She could maybe be the bottom of B, but I also don't think it's necessary really to use her as much. Again, I get it. You would love to have, the ability, or, having her do so much damage, AoE, and all that she has is really nice. And she's a mage. But, whether or not that's better than just picking someone like top model Luluka, taking Spirit Eye Celine, or whether or not you can even fit that in a team with Briarwitch Assyria when you already have characters like Coley, who are semi-soul efficient, or provide a disgusting amount of damage, to be honest. It's really up for debate. Now, of course, if you're fighting against evasion characters, maybe we can change the conversation a little bit, but depending on where you're using them, it's just, you would never really see someone pick like Architect Leica, especially in RTA, regardless of what the reason is, just because you need to be so flexible at the moment. Whether or not you need to 50-50, or whether or not you have coverage for other characters, is so important. So though I think some of these characters in here are in a similar caliber, like you may be able to anti-cleave someone with Sage Balances on, if there's a chance that the Zio, is ER, even if even if he doesn't have souls, or even if you have Bellion on your team, or even if you think that, the designer Lilibit can counter the Coley, if you end up in a situation where there's other characters that counter the designer Lilibit, it's really different as opposed to someone like Lone Crescent Bologna or some of these other characters at the top, where it almost doesn't feel like they have a counter, or there's a very strong counter that exists without there being like a very obvious downside to picking said counter. This is, again, no more the case, or especially the case, especially as you look at some of these other characters, including like the Silverblade Araminta, the Sylvan Sage, whether or not you would want to pick these characters. Like, oh yeah, like, wow, Coley can't debuff the Sylvan Sage, and then you have to deal with Renak, or, you know, oh my god, Ludwig does so much damage, and then you realize, oh my god, everything on the enemy team can't die, or it's free run or something like that. Point being, these are definitely fine in certain situations, especially in the 4th or 5th slot, or if you have like a very specific team, or if you're, I don't know, 340 Conqueror Lilius, my bad, I guess. But in most other cases, I don't think this is a tier where you would really pick any of the characters, unless if you have a really misplaying enemy team, or like a free Guild War defense that you can pick anything you want into it. As we move from the C, though, we have the D tier, and the D tier is almost exactly the same. All of these characters have some sort of like obvious counter here that makes them almost impossible to pick. Now, again, I don't really think that it's fair to say every single one of these characters is unusable. Like, I know I've shifted from C down to D, but I've seen, for instance, a few people, they will pick like Martial Artist Ken in response to someone taking Veronica against Shepherd of the Dark DN. And then obviously, since Veronica, like all Veronicas are built with crit, like the reality is that you'll S3 with... Did it again, sorry. Martial Artist Ken, or you'll S3 with Veronica onto the DN, and then you'll get provoked by the Martial Artist Ken, and then it's kind of over for the Veronica. So I've seen like a few fringe or like niche cases here. I've also seen people use Ashmancer Elena in certain cases, or even the off chance of a Navy Captain Landy when they're really out of options for countering. And if you don't have any of these other options, especially from the CBA tier list, or any other of the Covenant characters, or the, you know, the Amikis in the world, I could see why anti-cleaving with some of these characters is still fine, but it is exactly what you're looking at. They are almost like your last resort options. It doesn't feel particularly good if you end up outgearing someone because you just decided to pick Bride Senya and they could never do enough damage to you, and you're pairing it with someone like Yulha. More power to you. I love it. But there is very little here that these characters can do, especially to these stronger characters that are either more stats, or rather I should say, they either have more stats, they do what they do but better, especially with characters like Para Captain Fawn, or, you know, they're outdated with characters like Spectre Tenebria and characters like Archdemon Shadow. Now, I do hope that in the future these characters get revisited, and there are a few characters here that may get buffed in the future, I'm sure, to kind of compensate, even though some of them have been buffed already. But those are likely the worst characters that we have on the list, and everything else above them, I think you could maybe make a case if you're trying to either you know, build a specific team comp, or you know, I guess the real reason that you would pick something from this Milestone of Radiance tier list is you're just missing them for your collection log, or you really like them and you've always wanted them. That's always also fine too. That's something that I've definitely learned from having played many gacha games at this point, that, you know, the tier list can be thrown out the window if you just really love the character. If you really just love Ashmancer Elena or Faithless Litica, go for it. It's fine. Otherwise, though, I think what you're seeing is about what I would imagine most players and most people have experienced with the performance of these characters. You can maybe move some of the characters from B to A, again, depending on what sort of player you are or how frequently you have to use them. I would be lying if I said I didn't see a lot of the B tier almost like every game in, like, not just RTA, but in Arena, in Guild War. I feel like I always see Lionheart Sermia, I always see Bystander, and I always see Top Model or Spirit Eye Celine, but maybe that's just because of my playstyle and your experience is different. Of course, though, I do also remind you, you may want to wait for the Salome reveal and see exactly what she does or how she plays out. And otherwise, these other characters you have down here are not accessible. That's going to be it for the tier list, though. Again, you should feel free, of course, to pick whatever you'd like. But I think if you definitely pick anyone from the S to maybe B tier, I think you'll find some way, shape, form, or team composition where it'll feel good. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Please don't tear my head off in the comment section. See ya.